The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. We want to welcome you to the Mobilizing for Policy Action webinar hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Future. My name is Ann Palmer, and I'm a program director at the center. I'm going to first introduce our presenters today, then give you a brief description about the Food Policy Networks project, which is part of the center's work, and then talk a little bit about what we're going to cover. So we're very pleased that everybody is able to join us. I want to first introduce Kathy Green. Kathy is the Senior Director of Advocacy and Public Policy for the Capital Area Food Bank in Austin, Texas. In that role, she coordinates the advocacy and public policy efforts for the food bank at the state, local, and federal levels of government. Prior to the food bank, Kathy served as a senior policy advisor at the Texas Department of Agriculture. She has more than 20 years of experience working in governmental affairs and public policy as a legislative staffer, lobbyist, and policy analyst. Kathy got her bachelor's in government and English from the University of Texas in Austin, and she also chairs the Austin Travis County Food Policy Board and the Austin Independent School District School Health Advisory Council. Our next speaker will be Pam Roy. Pam is a native of New Mexico, and she's the executive director of Farm to Table, a New Mexico-based organization working on local and regional food and farm system initiatives, including farm to school with a focus on the relationships between food, health, and agriculture to policy work. She's the founder and coordinator of the New Mexico Food and Agricultural Policy Council. She serves on the Santa Fe Food Policy Council and is the Rocky Mountain Farmers Union government representative for New Mexico. She also works to organize voices from the local level to state and federal policy. And she has over 25 years experience in policy, advocacy, and organizational development, and has also worked internationally. Mark Winne is going to be our facilitator today, and he is a noted author, expert, and leading food systems policy advocate with over 40 years experience in community work and in policy. And he also works with the Center for Livable Future as a senior advisor to the Food Policy Networks project. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. I'm going to just give you kind of an overview of the center. Mark is going to talk about advocacy methods and the importance of developing an advocacy strategy. Then each of our presenters will talk for about 15 minutes. At the end of their talk, we're going to open it up for questions. You're welcome to write questions at any time in the question bar to the right of the screen. If you're having any echo incidences, just turn your volume down. That usually does solve that problem. Just want to make sure, let us know if there's any issues with hearing or understanding what people are saying, and we'll try to correct the technological problem. And then we're going to just go ahead and get started. So these are our speakers. We've already done the introduction to them. This recording is also sponsored by the Chesapeake Foodshed Network, and the Center for Livable Future is part of that network, and they're a collective impact initiative that is working in the Chesapeake region on food, lots of different food issues, but also on food policy specifically. The Center for Livable Future is located at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. We're an interdisciplinary center, and we focus on the intersection of diet, environment, food production, and public health. We have an education component. We do a lot of research, and then we also have 4 program areas. And the slide you're looking at right now reflects our Food Policy Networks project, which is one of our highlights, I think, in the work that we're doing. And the goal of this project is really to build the capacity of food system stakeholders to reform local, state, regional, and tribal food systems through effective public policy. And we do that through training, sharing best practices, networking with other food policy groups and leaders, and developing and providing food policy resource materials for groups and people like you who are working in this area. We have a listserv that we hope you're all subscribed to, about 1,300 people now. We have a resource database that we encourage you to look for any resources that you need, and we're happy to help you with that. There are close to probably 850 different resources on that database. We also have a directory of food policy councils that we update every summer, and we do these types of activities like the webinar which we do on an editorial calendar for quarterly communication and outreach activities. And then we also do a fair amount of training. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mark, who's going to take it from here.
Okay, thank you, Anne, and welcome everybody. I think we have two really wonderful presenters. Both Kathy and Pam have a tremendous amount of experience and history with advocacy and food policy and food policy council. So I'm just going to make a few sort of broad introductory remarks and hopefully frame the discussion for both of them to go into considerably more detail. So can we advance the slide? When I think about public policy and advocacy, I think what I've learned over the course of many years as well is that you have to be in it for the long term. Those who kind of want big wins quickly are often disappointed, and the best work, the best policy work, requires that one lay a good, strong foundation for the long term. So that's what I'm suggesting here in this first slide, is that there really are kind of two parts, or at least two time frames when it comes to advocacy. And it may take many years. In fact, I've often said it can take as long as 20 years for something really bold and significant to change, and that won't come in one big stroke. It may come with lots and lots of little steps. So to the extent that you kind of create a favorable environment to work in, a strong foundation, many participants, many stakeholders, the more likely it is that you're going to achieve long-term wins. I use the example of something as perhaps mundane as developing a comprehensive land use or development plan for a county. This is something that is often done once every 10, in some cases 20 years. But when it comes along, it's a good opportunity for you to work with county or local officials, usually planners, to introduce food systems, to introduce farm and ranching issues. We have done this in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I live, and so far we're starting to see, actually, I'd say harvest a number of really significant policy wins that started over 3 years ago. And we're starting to look at how we change our land use policies, how we change tax policies in order to favor agriculture, and how we begin to lay the groundwork for more new farmers. But this all started just because we decided to get involved in something that was a bit mundane and took quite a while before we were able to do something. It also does, by doing this, by talking about food policy, by doing reports, by engaging with people at different levels, we increase the receptivity for policy. Sometimes people don't even know what food policy is. It often takes a fair amount of time just to explain the concepts. And public education, as well as education of policymakers, is often required in order to make them receptive to more specific food policy actions. Of course, there are short-term opportunities, things that we can do that are more immediate. Specific issues and campaigns can be designed and hopefully can yield some wins within a much shorter time frame. Perhaps one suggestion or one area that we've seen a lot of progress in with food policy councils has been in rewriting zoning ordinances in order to promote urban agriculture. Fairly straightforward process. It can take a year or two of slogging through technical language and working closely with planners again, but this is the kind of close-in engagement that can yield a quick win, but it also can require a lot of relationship building with your policymakers. Next slide, please. And I say, don't overlook the simple stuff. It's not always as complex and technical as people might think. It's also very human. It requires that we develop relationships with people, both formally and informally. I still think that of all the things that I've been engaged in and the ways that I've been able to understand policy, the relationship building is still the most important feature. The legislative versus administrative advocacy is the difference between passing a law, so to speak, going to your legislature, going to your city council, getting an ordinance passed, or even something else, such as including a food concern, food project, food policy into a budget, or changing regulations. These are the things that actually codify the policies, but they often take a lot longer, and they're often a lot more work. The administrative side, which is simply working directly with public administrators, again, public health, planning, economic development, education, whether at the state or local levels, can yield a lot of much faster actions that don't require going to your legislative body or county commissioners. Always, this can be supported by providing those policymakers with lots of good information. Always look for opportunities to present at public hearings. Look for the small steps, such as passing memorials or resolutions or proclamations. It's as simple sometimes as going to the mayor and asking for a proclamation to be issued on Food Day. That this raises the consciousness and lays the groundwork for future efforts that are much more robust and more profound. Next slide, please. Also, along the lines of preparing the ground, tilling the earth, all those nice food metaphors and agricultural metaphors, think about food assessments and research as just another way of getting people ready for a more robust policy request. They shouldn't be overlooked. I mean, you're making your case. Again, a food assessment or even getting ready to develop a food plan or a food charter may take time. Well, they will take time. They're going to take a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years, but they make the case. They provide the data, they make the arguments, and they also build a much bigger audience of interested stakeholders who will buy into the plans and buy into the charters. So definitely look for those opportunities. Public forums and conferences definitely can raise awareness of issues. They can set the stage for action. So you need to also keep those types of options in mind. They're relatively easy to do, and they bring up the policy issues. They also identify what the problems are, and they also surface people who are going to be your stakeholders, your proponents, your supporters, and your constituents over time. This can all be supported by a strong communication plan, whether it's you're using social media or you're working with the conventional press, looking for opportunities to get newspaper articles, looking for reports, even if they're not the reports that you are doing yourselves, but others have done, perhaps at the national level, that make the case for the policy action you're looking for. All this contributes to long-term public awareness of food issues and leads to food policy actions. And lastly, I always put a lot of faith in the idea of serendipity. Stuff just happens, and you need to be ready for it. New information comes along. Suddenly an article appears in the local newspaper. There's somebody else who's interested in some aspect of the food system. It's a good opportunity to jump on board, talk to them, find out what this new research is, and see how it might fit into or translate into some future policy action. So that's a very broad framework I'd like to offer for your consideration. There's definitely a long-term game here that requires that you be strategic and be thoughtful, be intentional. I think there's also the work of just developing relationships with people in your community, both policymakers as well as people who are not necessarily in government or working at the policy level, and just numerous ways that communication can be used to make your case. So I'm going to move on from there, and we're going to start, I believe, with Kathy, and turn it over to Kathy Green from the wonderful town of Austin, Texas.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm very excited to be with all of you today and talk about what we're doing in Austin. As mentioned, I serve as the chair of the Austin-Travis County Food Policy Board. I've been a member of the board for 5 years and have been chair a little over 6 months. And you can go to the next slide. So a little bit about our board. We're a 13-member board, and we're jointly appointed by the Austin City Council as well as the Travis County Commissioners Court. And we were created by city ordinance in 2008. And our charge is twofold. It's improving availability of healthy food access for all residents, and then through the coordination of food and farming businesses and nonprofits. And we work really closely with all aspects of the food system. We try to really diversify our board in terms of membership. So we deliberately try to have somebody from the farming interest, maybe a local farmer or somebody who runs an urban farm. We try to have somebody from the retail aspect. We also have folks that are part of the higher education community. So we have someone from our University of Texas School of Public Health that serves on our board. We also have someone from the LBJ School, which is our public policy graduate school here in Austin. And then I, in my day job, I'm, as mentioned, the director of public policy for the Capital Area Food Bank. And so I represent the hunger advocacy interest. So we really try to look at all of those parts of the food system and who is taking a part in making sure that that food system operates. The other thing I would mention is we also have someone who's from the recovery part. So we have someone who is a represents the compost peddlers. That's the name of his group. And so we also look at recovery of food as a very important aspect of what we do. We really have worked to ensure that we are engaging the community as much as possible. In fact, our board had traditionally met at our city hall at noon on a Monday, and we decided that we would move our meetings to the evenings over in East Austin on Monday evenings, just to get more of the community involved. We felt like that was somewhere we were missing, and we really wanted to get more community engagement. Sometimes it's challenging because a lot of the folks that we are trying to serve better in the community don't have time to come down to a meeting. And so we really have made that a priority to engage the community as much as possible. You can go to the next slide. So a little bit about Austin. A lot of people know Austin is this great, funky, vibrant, live music city, well-educated, very prosperous. We have a big high-tech industry here. So we have a great reputation for things like South by Southwest and Austin City Limits Music Festival and all of these great things. But we are the most economically segregated city in the country. We have been documented as that. Austin has a physical dividing line, Interstate 35, and there was a historical deliberate plan to make it that way when Austin was first laid out. And so the traditional minority communities have been on the east side of Austin and have been separated physically and in many other ways by that dividing line. And so they have not been able to take part in the vibrant part of Austin. We have areas of Austin and Travis County where there isn't a full service grocery store for miles. And you see on this map, this is areas of Austin with limited access to fresh food. When you take this map and you actually overlay it with chronic disease rates, you'll see very clearly that we have areas of town where the access to food and the chronic disease coexist. And so we have a lot of issues in Austin with this situation. And so we really feel like our board's, one of its main goals is to try and address that inequality in terms of access to food and access to healthy food. Next slide. So the way that our board works is we actually work through working groups. Our board meets monthly, but then our working groups actually meet throughout the month at other times, and they are designed to include board members, but to also include members of the outside community. So we really feel like that is helpful in terms of community engagement, reaching out to those stakeholders that have an interest in these particular issues. Currently, we have 4 working groups. We have a farmland preservation working group. We have a codes and ordinances working group. We have a healthy food access working group. And then we have a 4th working group called budget and policy. And that working group specifically looks at any kind of budget recommendations or policy recommendations that we're going to be making as a board coming from the other working groups, and kind of works to massage those so we're ready to go out and meet with our elected officials. Long term, as Mark had mentioned, policy is not necessarily an instant gratification business. It takes a lot of time to sometimes get something passed or moved along. You might get one piece of the whole thing that you want passed the first go around, and it may be another year before you get the rest of it done. But in terms of affecting the long term, we were very deliberate about making sure that food policy and food systems were a part of our city's long-term comprehensive plan called Imagine Austin. As they were putting together that plan, we made sure that we were at the table and that we had food systems inserted wherever we could, where it was applicable. So on the health aspects of that comprehensive plan, on the planning and code ordinances part of that comprehensive plan, all of those different aspects where we could insert food systems, because we wanted to make sure as our city leaders were making decisions about the future of Austin over the next 30 years that they thought about food systems. We also are very involved with our community health improvement plan. If you're not familiar, under the Affordable Care Act, each hospital system is required to have a community health improvement plan. And here in Austin, our 2 major hospital systems were working on theirs, and so we worked with our local health department to ensure that food access was part of that community health improvement plan. And we made a very persuasive argument that food access is a health issue and that should be taken into consideration. So we worked very closely with our city and county health department on that CHIP plan. We also are very involved in our Code Next, which is our city's revision of the Land Development Code. So as Mark mentioned, that's another place that is really critical that you can be a part of if you can get your foot in that door. And so we make recommendations to that Code Next working group of the city to ensure that transportation to healthy food and food systems and using land that's vacant can be used for community gardens. All of those things are taken into account. We are also very careful to make sure that we look at research and best practices to support whatever we may ask for, any kind of policy or funding request. So that's where it's very valuable. Obviously, we have University of Texas right in our backyard, but ensuring that we have experts either on the board or come and brief the board that can support our work in terms of food policy. And we're backing up any kind of requests we make with research and best practices. And then lastly, developing our solid relationships with our elected officials and their staffs. I can't emphasize that enough. That's been so valuable to us. And so going and developing those relationships, not only when we actually want something, but just making sure that they know who we are. Since we are a city and county appointed board, obviously our elected officials appoint us, but we are one of many different boards and commissions that the city has, so we can't just assume that they are paying attention to us just because they appointed us. And so we make sure that they know who we are, they understand what the board is doing. We just had a turnover of a reconfiguration, I should say, of our city council here in Austin. So we went from an at-large member-at-large type city council to a single-member district city council. And so we have a bunch of new members that have only been in place about a year. When they got on the city council, we made sure that we went and visited with every single one of them and that they knew who we were. And it was just, a meet and greet sort of situation. Next one. So lessons learned and just working through this, don't assume anything. Repeated education and follow-up is critical. The way that we propose our issues to our City Council and Commissioners Court is to pass a formal resolution over to them. And early on when we were in this process, we assumed that just because we passed that on to them, they were reading those resolutions and taking notes. And we learned pretty quickly that that wasn't necessarily the case. It was one of many different pieces of information, paper that they get on a daily basis. And so we learned that we had to do advocacy around those resolutions. Without it, our issues were going to get lost in the shuffle. And so, as I mentioned, we're one of over 60 boards and commissions that are within the city. And so we had to repeatedly go and visit with our members of our City Council and Commissioners Court and say, look, we passed this resolution. We want to follow up with you. Here's the data. This is why we're doing what we're doing. And making sure that we were repeating the follow-up and sharing the information, very important. I'll also say that one of our strengths has been building coalitions outside the food system, the traditional food systems. So we have worked with our city transportation department, our public transportation, Capital Metro, working with them about planning and making sure that the future routes that they're planning for certain neighborhoods are going to take food systems into consideration. Working within our education arena, making sure that our public school systems have the support that they need in terms of food, really trying to build a robust farm to school program here in Austin. And then also obviously working with healthcare. I can't emphasize that enough, that the healthcare aspect of food is just one of those things that makes sense, but it's not something that everybody has necessarily thought of. So working with our hospital systems and our healthcare systems to ensure that looking at food access and healthy food access is a part of what they're doing and what they're emphasizing and supporting. And then lastly, I would say, keep your eye on the prize and know what your overall long-term end is. What's the big picture, and how are all these pieces that you're throwing forward going to get you there? Some of the policies and things that we're successful doing, and you can go to the next slide. So some of the successes that we've had with the Food Policy Board, several years ago, we had an urban farm ordinance that we passed. This is something that literally came out of left field, so to speak. We have several urban farms within the city of Austin, and there was a complaint issued by a neighbor of one of the urban farms, and that turned into a kind of bigger issue, and it kind of brought about the need to actually define what an urban farm was. We, up until that point, did not have anything in city ordinance that really defined what is an urban farm, what are they allowed to have, how do they operate, all of those things that really had just been kind of done on its own. It really wasn't very well thought out and defined. So just that incident in and of itself just brought the need forward. So we put together a working group, and we were able to try to involve stakeholders. This was a really sensitive issue because a lot of the urban farms, in fact, all of them, are located on the east side of Austin, which are traditionally minority neighborhoods. And so Austin has a big issue with those neighborhoods being gentrified and turning over, and the people that have lived in those neighborhoods for a long time really feeling like they are being priced out of their neighborhoods, and that all those issues were already happening. And so we knew that we were getting into what was a very sensitive area. So we were very deliberate about making sure that we included the community in those discussions about the urban farms, and made sure that we had the neighborhood groups and all of those folks around the table when we were putting together this ordinance that we got City Council to pass. But and it was a very somewhat painful process, but we stuck to it. We made sure that we were very collaborative. We took a lot of stakeholder input. We had meetings in the evenings, on the weekends, so that we can make sure that we heard from all members of the community, because we felt like this was a very important issue. We wanted to support our urban farms, but we also wanted to support the needs of the community and their perspective. We also have been successful in getting funding for SNAP enrollment for food stamps. That is one area that we are very lacking in here. We realize that we have a lot of folks that are eligible for SNAP but may not be enrolled in it for whatever reason. And so we were able to make the case for the need to get more people enrolled. We did a lot of research on the economic benefit to the city on having more people enrolled in SNAP. And so we were able to fund a position that does SNAP enrollment and outreach, and then also do some campaign work to get an outreach campaign going and making sure that people know about SNAP. And then we also have been able to get some funding to support the Double Dollars program at our farmers market. So our farmers markets previously had a grant through Wholesome Wave that provided the double dollars for SNAP and WIC recipients. But we realized that, that was a limited pot of money. And so we were able to get some city funding. And that was based on a successful model that had been in place for several years. And we were able to show City Council, hey, this is something that's working and we need to do more of it. So those are three success stories that we've had at the Austin Food Policy Board. There are several others that we're working on, and hope that we'll have more success stories to show in the future. That's what I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Up next, we have Pam Roy with the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. Pam, are you there?
Hello, good day. How's everybody there and out there? Can you hear me?
We can.
Fantastic, thanks. Thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all today. And again, my name is Pam Roy, and I'm the Executive Director of Farm to Table. We're a nonprofit here in Santa Fe. You can go to my first slide, please. Thanks. So just a little bit of background. I really appreciate both Mark and Kathy and Ann, of course, laying the landscape, and Kathy's focus on talking about sort of more that local food policy council work and efforts. And so what I want to do is describe a little bit about relationships of food policy councils and our work here in New Mexico, and then take you a little bit broader from local really to state. We work a lot on state issues, yet it's so important to be connected to, for us with state, at our state food policy council, to be connected with local food policy councils or groups, local groups and state groups that are working on food, agriculture, health policies. And so I'll get a little bit more into that in a bit. So the connection with Farm to Table as a nonprofit organization, we were actually set up about 15 years ago, and as an outcome of working on farmers market work, a lot of farmers market development, and a lot of early on work of getting supplemental nutrition assistance program, back then it was food stamps, as part of farmers market development. And having done that, I spent a lot of time really learning that policy was a very important thing to be involved in, and that was an important part of all of our work, no matter what we were doing when it came to food, health, farming, education, and all kinds of things. So as a nonprofit organization, when we were set up, part of our mission literally is to work on policy work. So having said that, we then started about 13 years ago, the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council, one of the longest going food policy councils in the country at this point. But we definitely had the opportunity to learn from folks like Mark Winne, who was at the time working with the Connecticut Food Policy Council. So we were, just a little bit of background, we were actually organized at the state level and through a House Joint Memorial, that was what it was called, where we educated our policymakers about what food policy councils are, what we want to do, who needs to be at the table. And we are a public-private sector partnerships. So it means we have agencies and organizations at the table. And you'll see on that slide, we have agencies and organizations that represent food, health, hunger, agriculture, education, nutrition, economic development, and environment as well. And then, so just then going to the local level, about 8 years ago, and Mark was part of this, Mark and myself and others, we started the local Santa Fe Food Policy Council. And similar to what Kathy was sharing, it's set up similarly. It is an appointed 13 appointees and appointed by the city and the county of Santa Fe. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give an example of one initiative that we started at we really have been focusing on for now about a dozen years through the New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. And this goes to what both Mark and Kathy have talked about, which is, you know, it's important to have what I call the long haul, long view on these issues. And many times they're complex, and you just have to know you're going to be involved in the work for a fairly long period of time. And you want partners that are interested in that as well. Having said that, as a statewide food policy council that's been around for quite a while, we realize that some folks come and go, and that's okay. And you know, people's interests change or their priorities change over time. So just a little bit of background, and we've worked on numerous issues, and similarly to Kathy, actually at the state level, worked on the double up food box for farmers markets and a lot of support for farmers markets here in the state as well as at the federal level. But for this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about our New Mexico Grown program, which is several things. It's about getting fresh fruits and vegetables into school meal programs and also the educational side of it. But this started way back in 2001, where we had a House memorial, state level, introduced the idea of farm to school and the idea of linking farmers to schools and sort of education programs that are focused on food in schools that were really happening back that long ago, 15 years ago. But it was the very first time our legislators had actually really had any idea that there's something like farm to school, or had even thought about it. So a little bit fast forward, that was pre the development of our New Mexico Food and Agriculture Policy Council. So that happened in about 2003. And then, so some of our very first efforts were looking at how we could build these relationships with our policymakers at the state level. And then, because we were focused on school food and the school environment and how we could connect farmers to our school environment, we realized that we would actually have to be focusing on federal policy as well, because school meal programs are predicated by federal policy. But we started very much at the state level first, and in 2005 introduced a competitive foods in schools bill to minimize the competitive foods in the schools. So we were actually one of the first few states, you know, about 12 years ago, that actually focused on minimizing and getting the state to actually minimize things like vending machines in the schools and focusing on what ends up on the tray, and also minimizing things like any outside foods like McDonald's and things like that. And we were able to get that passed. But it meant it wasn't just passing a rule-making process, a rule at the state level. It meant actually a year-long process with our public education department to predicate those rules. And it was arduous, and they weren't very happy about it. They didn't want to have to do that, but they did. And it was a lot of public hearings, and then we actually then worked as a food policy council to get folks to those hearings who were school food service directors, teachers, physicians, youth programs that were involved in school food, to advocate for minimizing the competitive foods. At the same time, we were working on then trying to figure out how we could get more locally grown, New Mexico grown, fresh fruits and vegetables in the school meals program. So we started an appropriation request a couple of years after that we've been running at our every year with our legislature. We ask actually for $1.44 million, but currently there's $473,000 available to schools statewide to be able to purchase New Mexico grown fresh fruits and vegetables from our farmers. So outside of that legislative process, though, we've worked very much hand in hand on the local policies, school policies. So policies that schools have to adhere to in the sense of being able to purchase local food. So having learned more from our schools, we realized that one of the big issues was something that was actually a federal rule. Our schools had to pay, take the lowest bid. And so we worked then with national groups, other groups like the National Farm to School Network and National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition and other groups to actually focus on some of those federal regulations. And in doing so over the last, as you'll see, sort of 6, 7, 8 years at this point, collectively we were able to change some of the things, some of the prior requirements. Schools now across the country are supposed to actually provide twice as many fruits and vegetables and a little less starch, which is to us a big win. And we were able to get something called the geographic preference. It's a rule at the federal level, but it really is helping us at the state and local level. Geographic preference means schools can actually buy local, pay a little bit more for it if they want to, and prioritize local if they'd like. Next slide. So fast forward, I've talked a lot about sort of what it takes, who some of the folks are that you want to have at the table. So, and when you're planning and you're working on these things, you want to think about who's at the table and who needs to be there. So obviously around our New Mexico Grown program, we've done lots of outreach to schools and farmers. One of our major partners in our work is the New Mexico School Nutrition Association. And they are the folks who actually work in the schools to be able to provide food for our students and our kids, and farmers, and families and students. So we've worked very hard to really focus on these, who's out there in the community. And as I mentioned, institutions, Kathy mentioned school boards, very important. Your public education departments, departments of agriculture. We work closely with our human services department because they actually have a warehouse where they move a lot of product, food product into the schools. And we've been able to piggyback on their trucks with some of our farmers' produce to the schools that have wanted it. And then there's the idea, and Kathy mentioned this, some of those organizational champions that we really want to have at the table as well. So nutritionists, as I mentioned, also physicians are important, health providers. We have the New Mexico Health Council, our New Mexico Public Health Association, and other organizations like that. And one to not overlook is our Association of Counties. And I'll mention a little bit more about that in a bit. And again, those policymakers at the state, local, and federal levels. Next slide, please. So, so when thinking about, and really you want to think about a strategy. And it might be multiple strategies. So just a few things to consider when we're working on policies is it an appropriation request? Are you asking for money? Is it a good budget year? In New Mexico, kind of like Kathy was saying about Austin, New Mexico, we've had one of the worst economic years, and because our state budget is predicated on the oil and gas industry. And so we really have had to, but it has helped us actually put a much greater lens on agriculture and our food system and the economic opportunities. So when we talk to our policymakers, we really talk to them about that. So yes, we're in a deficit type situation in New Mexico, but we have some great ways of talking about economic activity and opportunities in food and agriculture systems. So our issues are becoming much more popular. Sometimes, you know, our policymakers like to think about when it's an election year. I'm talking about some of those issues, and I always think that that's a good thing as long as in a positive context. If we know that that's going to happen, we kind of make sure they get the right information. And as Kathy mentioned, it's always really good to have lots of information that you want and in the words that you think are going to be most important. Local to state, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Okay. And just some of the materials, and then I'm going to get to sort of those partners from the local to state level. So things to think about, briefing sheets. We always make sure, and this is a very coordinated effort through our partners at our New Mexico Food and Ag Policy Council, that what we give out is what everybody wants to say. And sometimes it's an arduous process to work through, you know, sort of negotiating how we want to say things. And we always make sure our information is really positive. It has facts. It's backed by facts. Kathy mentioned that as well. And that when we are talking to policymakers, if they ask us a question and we can't answer, we say, we'll get back with you on it. We don't make anything up in the moment. We just then follow up. And it's a great opportunity to be able to build those relationships is any kind of follow-up. So social networks, social media, radio opportunities are always important, and speaking engagement. Next slide, please. So back to the idea of local and state. How does that work? So I'm going to give an example of something. Mark mentioned things like memorials and resolutions. So with our New Mexico Grown program, there are all kinds of different ways to actually create voices, especially when you're going to your state legislatures. So we actually created a resolution that we've now gotten passed as our Santa Fe Food, with our Santa Fe Food Policy Council. We take it to our city councilors and our county commissioners. We also share it out with other local policy groups across the state. And it's a resolution in support of the New Mexico Grown program and any legislation that we're working on at that period of time. And so we get the cities and counties to pass these resolutions. And a lot of times folks don't know that our cities and counties actually have lobbyists that spend their life day and night at the legislature every year, and also follow-up bills during the interim committee hearings and things like that. So we're able to get, through our Santa Fe Food Policy Council, our city and county lobbyists, and they work hand in hand. They are at every hearing. They follow up. We strategize together. So it's a great way to think about some of those wonderful partners that we can have that way. And some of our city councilors and county commissioners show up as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we do to really provide this sort of broad-based education together is through an initiative we started several years ago called the New Mexico Food and Farms Day. And this is at our legislature. It's a one-day event, but it brings that cross-sector of public and private sectors, agencies, organizations. We do tabling. We have a big event. We do a press conference. This year we had our very first annual Farm to School Awards, and we had our federal policymakers staff. They gave a message from our Senator Udall, Senator Heinrich, Congresswoman Lujan Grisham, and Congressman Lujan. Presented it, and as part of Food and Farms Day, city councilors, county commissioners, and our state policymakers. And there we were, right in our own capital. We also then created, like I said before, resolutions. These are called memorials at the state level. And we then had our state legislators introduce in both the House and the Senate Food and Farms Day, School Nutrition Day, Cooking with Kids Day, and we coordinated all these different messages so that they linked up together. And then we immediately had a press conference right after that. So we keep following up, and we do year-round advocacy. We create positive voices. We really help people think that through. And we always say much better to talk about things in a positive framework. So just a few last things, and you can go to the next slide. as Mark mentioned, there's all kinds of opportunities to engage, not only at the city and county level, but we also go to interim committee hearings, so I organize those for a lot of folks, and our state legislature has hearings across the state on all kinds of issues: rural development, tribal, health, economic development, agriculture, water uses. And so I try and actually coordinate about at least three different interim committee hearings. And we did one with our tribal community members, again around food and farming initiatives that affect tribal communities. And then we link them to our New Mexico Grown program, to farmers markets, economic development, all kinds of different issues. We did a really extensive one with our Health and Human Services Interim Committee this last summer, focusing on the double up food bucks at farmers markets and on New Mexico Grown produce for school meals and the economic opportunities, the health opportunities for the state. So just a few examples there. And as Mark mentioned, and Kathy, you want to be in it for the long haul. During these, over the years, we also put reports together. We've done one on food gap, on farm to school. We did a recent report on procurement, public procurement in our prisons and schools and hospitals and senior centers. And then just this last month, we did a 3-year strategic plan for the New Mexico Grown Fresh Fruits and Vegetables Initiative. So onward we go, and I'll look forward to, like Mark said, being in this for another 20 years or so. I hope anyway. So with that, thanks so much for the opportunity to be with you all today, and I look forward to questions and answers.
Thank you, Pam. That was wonderful. And thank you, Kathy, as well. We have time now for questions and answers. If you have any questions, please type them into the question box or the chat box, and we will be reading them aloud for our panelists to respond
to. Karen, I'd like to ask a question. This is Mark.
Go for it.
Okay. So I'd like to, yes, I want to encourage the participants to share their thoughts. I saw all the cowboy hats in that last photo, and I thought, geez, people must think this is a totally Southwest-centric kind of presentation. But I think that the issues and the strategies and the methods that both Kathy and Pam raised are fairly universal. And as I've worked around the country with different food policy councils, I've seen that that it's definitely the case that there's no one way you do it in one place and perhaps another way somewhere else. But I do want to ask both Pam and Kathy if you could sort of very briefly respond to perhaps the concern that how much are you influenced based on whether or not you are a part of government? In other words, if you're working closely with government, or if you're, like the Travis County Austin group, if you are a part of government, and in New Mexico Food and Ag Policy Council, you're independent, to what extent does that influence your choice of methods? Kathy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, since we are appointed by the Austin City Council and the Travis County Commissioners Court, and we are actually an official board and commission of the city, definitely anything we do is all out in the public. We have to have open meetings. We have to post our meetings. So we have to follow all of those aspects. We have rules in terms of a quorum. So for instance, we could not have a quorum of our board go and meet with a city council member, or because we would violate quorum. So there's some things around that we have to follow. But other than that, I think by the virtue of us being appointed by the city council and the commissioners court, we have a duty to report back to them and to advise them in aspects of food policy. So I think we're fortunate in that we have their ear. But one reason we formed our working group on budget and policy is we had a few key members of our board that we felt had a bigger interest in going and doing advocacy. And so the four of us actually worked together to go make visits with city council and commissioners, and those personal visits, and those are just key. There's no substitute for the personal meeting and the face-to-face communication, and whether it be with the member themselves or their staff members. And I think that applies to the state level as well. You may have an elected official and you may wish you can meet with them, but meeting with key staff is equally often as effective.
So, Pam, do you have any thoughts on this? Is there anything that you would have done or not done based on the fact that you are, a fairly independent group and not immediately beholden to state government?
Right. Actually, I think both ways. Kathy's perspective with the Senate, like our Santa Fe Food Policy Council, we're set up very similarly. And with our statewide Food Policy Council, we are independent of government, even though we have government at the table. And we were very, very deliberate about that here in New Mexico. We wanted to make sure that our Food Policy Council would be able to work through every administration, any change in state administration. Sometimes there's more interest at the state level and by a governor, or like, for instance, the Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Education. And then sometimes when those positions change, the interest changes. And so we were deliberate about being independent of government in that sense, yet we were also very deliberate about making sure that we have our agencies at the table. So health, human services, agriculture, public education, as much as possible. And so that we have a very good understanding, private and public sector, of what our roles and responsibilities are to the work that we are working on. We learn wholeheartedly from our colleagues inside government what their needs are, how to move an issue, and then we're able on the outside of government to be able to advocate for that more freely. So it's really important. We're not a special interest group, and I think that's really important to say that. We're many groups, and sometimes it means that we move things along a little more slowly because it's very broad-based. But that has actually served us quite well, and we've gotten a lot more partners on board. People want to be a part of the Food Policy Council. So it's helped us a lot. And Kathy said something that was really important when it comes to whether it be city, county, state, or federal policymakers. Being in touch with and creating relationships with their staff it's so important. They are our friends. They are our supporters in all of this work, and they help guide us as well, and they help deliver our message.
So if there are questions or comments from the participants, we'd love to have you send them in. While we're waiting for everybody to get their thoughts together,
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Mark, I was talking to myself on mute. We have a question that is for Pam that kind of tags on to the last discussion about the relationship with government and their influence. And it's a question about, since state legislators, their time is often limited during session, how do you go about getting their attention, drawing them to events? How do you engage with them so that they're present at the events that you host in New Mexico?
Oh, great question. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. During your legislative process, and every state's different. New Mexico, our sessions are really short. This year was our budget session, so every other year the budget session is 1 month long, and then on the odd years it's 2 months. So, and I would say then working within the legislative session is kind of like a vortex. It's intense. Our legislators are focused on a million different things. They are very focused. So you want your messages to be really clear, really succinct, on target. You want everybody to have the same message, and you want those messages to be really positive. Even if you're asking for something that's maybe a little hard, you know, but you want to be able to frame things in a way that's very positive, because if it's not, it's like that is not something we want to hear. It's why I said that it's really important to work outside that legislative session just as much, if not more, actually, in interim committee hearings. And there was that picture of the, as Mark mentioned, the folks in the cowboy hats. That was actually a farm tour. So we do our best to try and get folks out on farms and in community settings, so they're getting a chance to meet with folks in their own hometowns. Headed actually next week to visit with some farmers and in a community that's working on farm to school. And I've asked several of the policymakers, state legislators, to join us in those meetings. They're farmers too, and they want to learn, and some of them are interested in maybe even selling to their schools. So you never know, right? But you want to do things outside of that legislative session as much as possible to engage policymakers. That's everything, like I said, from local, state, and federal.
Thank you, Pam. We have a question for Kathy, and the question is about funding. Where did the funding for the SNAP enrollment and for the Double Dollar program come from?
So the funding for the SNAP enrollment is actually a part of the city budget, and so we were able to secure that funding, and it's ongoing funding to support that enrollment position, and then also to support some outreach campaign type funding. The Double Dollars, previously the Sustainable Food Center, who runs a bunch of our farmers markets here in town, was able to secure funding for Double Dollars through a grant they got through Wholesome Wave. They've also received some money here locally from one of our foundations, but the funding that was provided for that was also city budget funding, and it just supplemented the program that was already in place and helped expand it a little bit. So they already did have funding for it, but it was able to provide that program to more SNAP recipients. So both city budget funding.
Great, thank you. Another question for both of you is in regard to issues of equity. How do you galvanize support within a community that may be multicultural and speak multiple languages?
Well, here in Austin, the primary other language besides English is going to be Spanish because of, and it's probably that way in New Mexico as well, just because of our proximity to the border. We do have other languages represented in Austin, like Vietnamese and some other cultures that have come in. We really try to meet the community where they are. So either, I think holding meetings downtown at City Hall is an intimidating thing sometimes. And so we try to have community meetings at times of the day or the evening where we get input. And so we might go to a local church, or we might go to a local community center and hold a meeting so that we can reach more of the community and try to listen. We try not to come into a part of the community and proclaim that we have all the answers to fixing the food system in that neighborhood. And so we really try to listen as to what the needs are instead of coming in and saying, this is what we think you should have. So I think that's a lot of it. And try to involve members of those communities in our deliberations and our working groups as well.
And this is Pam, just to follow up on Kathy's suggestions. Very similarly, we do the same thing, which is much more in community around some of these issues, meet people where they're at. And I always feel like there's so much more to do, but we work collectively, like for instance, with a group called the Southwest Organizing Project. which is based in Albuquerque, but they do statewide work, and they are very based in community. And so we partner with organizations like them, Blasphemia Food Center, which is in the southern part of the state. They work in the colonias areas, again, very much community-based. And then out on the Navajo Nation, the Dene Food Sovereignty Alliance. And so what we do is we coordinate with some of the groups that are in community, focused on really specific issues, work face-to-face. And then, for instance, if it's a state issue, we'll try and help them coordinate an interim committee hearing out in their community. So they're meeting with legislators in their own community, in their own setting, and we take a very back seat approach to that. We're not the front face. We just help to coordinate things like that. And so we try to do a lot of different things that really help communities be the ones who are face to face with their policymakers. We could do more, always.
Great, thank you. Another question for you is, do you have any suggestions of resources or a checklist, resources that you turn to that to help groups get started, to help them with their strategy planning? And this is for all three of you.
I mean, I think what Mark and all of y'all have done through the Center for a Livable Future is a great resource. So I think a lot of the information that you provide there is great. And then we just try to do a lot of research and look at best practices across the country. We learn a lot from other policy councils and look at what they're doing, in Portland, or they're doing in, another part of the country. And, is that something that we could do here? So we're constantly kind of doing that research.
And this is Pam. I agree. Thank you so much for the Center for Livable Futures, and I know that was an outgrowth of a lot of work, and really appreciate the tools and resources that you provide to all of us and many others. What we like to do is we like to forward your information on Facebook and other things like that. The other is, especially because some of the issues we work on at the federal level, we're a partner with the National Farm to School Network. We're also a member of the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. As two examples, as ways to partner with organizations that have policy folks in Washington, D.C. So when it comes to linking our state work to federal work, or even local to federal work too, we have some folks that we can really lean on in the DC area, and they have been instrumental in us being able to work with our own policymakers here in New Mexico in supporting various change. The other thing I really suggest is never to overlook the administration. So working with your own departments of agriculture, departments of education, workforce development, human services and health, and then also at the very federal level, the Food and Nutrition Services, USDA, and to always have relationships with the folks who are in those offices too, because they're there to help us, and they want to succeed, and that's their job. I mean, they want us to succeed at our jobs. So it helps them to have relationships out in the field.
I'll just add, this is Mark, that as Karen said, we have a lot of resources available at the Food Policy Network's project with Center for a Livable Future, so I would check them out. I tend to advise people to look at doing food policy councils right, because it's just a really quick introductory view of how to get started if you're at that very early stage. Looking more closely at policies themselves and at what levels of government you're able to utilize to get those policies addressed. I urge you to look at the Harvard Food Policy Law Center. They have two guides on good laws, good food, one for the state level and one for the local level. And I am always willing to chat with anybody who wants to be in touch with me to help you get started.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a few more questions. One is for Kathy in terms of the relationship between the City of Austin and Travis County. In your work, your board stretches beyond two jurisdictions. Do they align? And then also, are there communities that beyond Austin that are benefiting from the work of the Policy Council?
Yes, so Austin is, kind of the center of Travis County. We're obviously the biggest city within Travis County, but we do have other municipalities. We do work with staff at the Travis County Health Department, who's kind of our liaison, and then our Office of Sustainability for the city, and make sure that we're communicating with each other and try to make sure that our county commissioners court and our county judge are updated as we are doing things at the city and vice versa. But yes, we actually have had some success with some of our other municipalities. We have some in the eastern part of the county that have been in need of support in terms of just food access. And so through our community health improvement plan, which is actually a countywide plan, and in our work in that, we have been doing some additional work with the school districts and then also with some of the organizations out in the eastern part of the county to try to improve food access out there. So we actually have had some success outside of the city of Austin for sure. And that has really just been being involved with the stakeholders, being involved with the organizations that were working in those areas.
Great, thank you. And then I think we have time for one more question, and there have been a couple that have come through the question box, and it's around funding. There's, what is the magic bullet of funding for councils, but do you have any advice in terms of how your councils get funding to support the work that you do on policy?
As far as the Austin Travis County Policy Board goes, so the work of the council, and we're all volunteers that actually sit on the board, and so we're not obviously paid for our time as members of the board, but we depend a lot on just partners in terms of volunteer time, engaging students at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Hey, this would be a great research project for you to work on, and would you be willing to help us with that? So a lot of in-kind type efforts. And then we do have a food policy manager at the city, which has really been helpful and critical to our work. And we actually made that recommendation several years ago to our city council that we thought that food policy was important enough that we actually have somebody at the city that works on that. So that person is kind of our staff liaison and helps us with the day-to-day planning meetings and getting initiatives off the drawing board into action and some things like that. So it's just a combination of things, really.
And here in New Mexico, similarly, like Kathy said, at the local level with our Santa Fe Food Policy Council, actually are in part funded by the city and the county. A bit of funding in each of the budgets for halftime coordinator and some of the expenses that are needed for a food policy council. What I'd love to see at the local level is that we've had full-time funding. That would be very helpful to have that. There's enough work certainly to keep a full-time staff person involved in coordinating all of it. And then at the state level, we've had a mix of things. We did get some early on state funding to get us going, and that was through the legislature, and it was a good way to actually educate our policymakers about the Food Policy Council, but without them having ownership over it, let's put it that way. And mostly funded by foundations and some federal grant programs over the years as well. And as Kathy said, working with our universities with students to help on research projects. We've also had AmeriCorps, Food Corps members, Congressional Hunger Fellows. Our Congressional Hunger Fellows actually helped us with 2 very large reports, one which was called Ending New Mexico's Food Gap, that was very early on and actually used at the federal level to really kind of educate the field in what happens in rural communities and what are some of those gaps around food access. And thus moving into the whole issue around food deserts across the country. So it's a mix of funding efforts for sure.
This is Mark, and I just want to add on this point that one thing that we're seeing is that there is growing interest on the part of foundations, private foundations, community foundations, family foundations, in funding public policy, even advocacy. Going back not too many years, there was a fair amount of resistance to the idea of supporting advocacy work because it was thought to infringe on too many sort of sacred areas, perhaps. But we're seeing a real sea change in that. So food policy advocates and food policy councils looking for support for their work should definitely be checking out their own area's foundation community.
Thank you. And with that, we are at time. Mark, do you have any final thoughts or comments?
I think only that, again, thank Kathy and Pam. Very, very good, very solid presentations. We appreciate that. And again, we at CLF are very happy to speak with you. And I guess my just a word of encouragement is that you need to engage. You need to be out there. You need to be building relationships, and just putting your ideas out there. Raise your hand and tell people this is what you want. So good luck with that. I think you'll definitely succeed. And yes, be in it for the long haul.
Thank you. Thank you all. We'll send out a recording of the webinar and the slides to everyone afterward, along with some additional handouts from our presenters. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation.